Welcome to the Talking Toughness series of podcasts, where we examine the mental toughness concept with guests from a wide range of sectors, illustrating that our mental approach to what happens to us and around us matters for all of us. Our guests come from the worlds of business and public service, education, social mobility, sport, and health. They all share their experiences and their observations about the factors that have enabled them to survive and to thrive on their journey through life. Many guests have gone further and incorporated the concept into what they do as coaches, trainers, managers, and leaders, helping others to thrive in their turn. Their experiences are valuable to those of us who strive to do the same. Our guest for this podcast is Anthony Taylor, someone who we at AQR International have got to know very well over the years. Anthony has become something of an expert in the application of the mental toughness concept in his work with business leaders, particularly in UK medium-sized businesses, helping them to address challenges and to seize the opportunity to grow and develop. His approach, as you will shortly hear, is as holistic as it is thoughtful. It is customized to the needs of each and every client, and it joins different strands through the application of the mental toughness concept. As a result, his track record is excellent, and it is why his business is so successful. He can honestly be described as someone who is learning orientated and brings the benefit of that to all of his clients. John and I are delighted to welcome Anthony to this discussion. Well, Anthony, it's really good to have you with us. I'm going to kick off with a question. It's a fairly straightforward question. What prompted you 10 years ago to move into consultancy, particularly consultancy that focused on people in organisational development?
Hi, Doug. Well, yeah, great to join you and John today, and thank you for that. God, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I found myself at a bit of a life crossroads, if I'm being honest, about 12 years ago. That kind of forced me to really reevaluate what I've been doing. So I've been head of comms, communications for various large organizations in both the public and the private sector, and I've grown a bit disillusioned with it, to be honest. And part of that was down to working with people that were not great examples of leaders, I think was probably a polite way of putting it. And then coupled with a couple of life events that sort of really challenged me. In the space of 12 months, 18 months, went through an unexpected breakdown of a marriage, unemployment, and then a parental bereavement. And sort of just, like I said, sort of forced me to kind of reevaluate it. And in that period, I thought, I'd become a coach a few years before that and just loved everything about that, and actually wanted to change direction a few years before, and decided that's what I wanted to do, was to go into coaching and development, and hopefully have a small impact in that. If I can try and work with individuals to become better leaders, more self-aware, then actually I could stop people having the kind of work experiences that I've had. So that kind of sums it up in a couple of minutes, probably, as to why I did that change.
That's great. And how long did it take you to get going? Because this is a question we get asked a lot by people who come to us. There would be coaches, or there would be want to start their own business. And I think I know what the answer is going to be, but let's hear yours.
Yeah, it took a few years. So if I'm being honest, one of the first things I did, was, having made that decision, was realize I need to kind of get trained up a bit. And one of the first investments I actually made was, funnily enough, was in becoming a mental toughness practitioner. Partly because I'd always been interested in sport. I played rugby and done cross country at a high sort of amateur level, or highish amateur level. And so I'd already read around the subject and understood the concept a little bit, but was curious about it. And then with the life challenges, wanted to understand, well, how had mental toughness helped me go through those, and how could I develop it? But then going back to your original question, was probably a few years, because what I'd do was I'd go and all gung-ho, and I went into this, and then I'd run out of money, and I was a single dad at the time, and I'd go, oh shit, I run out of money. And then I'd have to go back into what I was doing before as a consultant. So I created a bit of a niche for turning around poorly performing comms teams. So I'd do that for 6, 12 months, raise a bit of money, go and do this again, run out of money, and then go, oh God, and then go back and do that. And that probably lasted for about 2.5 years.
I'm interested there, Anthony. Then you talk about working with comms teams and stuff like that, and I think a lot of the stuff on mental toughness, originally we used to pretty much focus on individuals and individual coaching and stuff like that. How do you see something like mental toughness fitting into like how teams work together and influencing any of that kind of dynamic?
Oh, it's so important. It's you're absolutely right. We used to think about seeing mental toughness as something to perhaps build up in individuals when they were going through difficult times, maybe. But actually, it's so much more important than that. I've used it for a number of scenarios with different organizations to help individuals and teams understand how they think, because we know, mental toughness is how we think when we're exposed to stresses and pressures and opportunities. It gives you that really good insight. So a great example, I work with a really big organization in the environmental services space. And initially, the engagement was around helping a particular team of about 200 improve their resilience as part of a significant change program, 18 months into a 2-year program. And they're really looking to sort of give them the tools to help get them over the line after this 18 months of intense pressure. So one of the first things I did was measure their levels of mental toughness and did it by team. But then what I was able to show them was actually break it down by team and look at the profile of each team to give their senior leaders greater insight into why one team was thinking or performing a little bit better or differently from another area based on their profiles. And then give each of those teams individually greater insight into how they were, one colleague was thinking differently from the other and how they could start to work better. So it's such a useful tool to be working with individuals and teams, just to give that really good insight. Because, as we say, you can't see how somebody thinks. You can see behavior. We know about the other tools that are great at showing behavioral profiles, but actually you can't see how somebody thinks. And this just gives that insight that is really unique.
Yeah, I think that's such a good explanation, because like when you're working in teams, of course, we all kind of live inside our own head. So when someone behaves a certain way, the easiest thing to think is, well, if I was to behave that way, here's what I'd be thinking. So that and then you kind of just project that onto them. Yeah. That must be what they're thinking, and we kind of have that blind spot there. Do you ever come across teams that are, or how often do you come across teams that are kind of open enough where, like generally I find sometimes with mental toughness and subjects like that, people kind of want to hold it as, oh, this is my own. And of course, as a coach, you're not really going to go in and go, right, here we go. Everyone's going to see everyone else's profile and stuff like that. But I think there are teams that would be pretty open to that. What would be your take? How easy is it, do you think, to work with teams where you think, do you know, we could probably share profiles and understand people a bit better?
I think it's like the mental toughness spectrum itself. You've got teams that occupy both ends of the spectrum and those that are in the middle. I've come across some where as soon as you say the words mental toughness, the barriers go up. It's the kind of, oh, are you going to say I'm mentally weak? It's like, no, we're not. Let's understand it. So I think the key to it in teams is in the setup. How is it pitched? How is it presented? And we start to think about it in that way. So I work with a law firm recently down south who were having some challenges with some of their younger lawyers who were perhaps not having high levels of emotional control. Maybe sort of there was a few outbursts, a few, throwing the toys out the pram, as they were sort of saying, a bit struggling with that. And one of the things we did was to look at their individual mental toughness profiles, and we ran some workshops around developing that. But even amongst that group, there was some that were really embracing it. Oh, I really want to know mine. That's really interesting. And there were some that were really reticent and had perhaps negative images around, you're going to say I'm mentally weak and I don't want to. And then, of course, once I framed it with them and got them to understand really what mental toughness is and explained it, the barrier started to come down. So I think using it in teams can be hugely enlightening, but it's the keys in the setup, how it's pitched and presented right at the start.
Absolutely.
That chimes with my experience as well, Anthony. But it raises an interesting question about, our mission really is to get the whole world, everybody, to understand mental toughness and become self-aware about it and get the benefits from understanding that. And I can see, and I relate to working with a very specific group of people. If you stand in front of a group of people, you can explain it to them and gradually get them on board. But our biggest challenge is persuading the people we never stand in front of. The people out there who are reading our LinkedIn posts. As a person who's got a really good background in communications, how would you address that challenge?
I think it is a challenge. I think it's around trying to destigmatize it. I think that concept of it, and speak to people at an emotional level. Once you share things with them at a logical level, they kind of get it. I think it's how do you take the sting out of their initial emotional reaction to the concept. I think that the term mental toughness has been used in the context of sport for so long, or pushing through tough times. There's so many, as we know, common fallacies around it. And how do we bypass some of those fallacies that are probably at the front of people's minds? And that's where I think now we're getting a really good network of practitioners that are using it, and the momentum's behind it. You'll start, I see some really interesting different ways that people are communicating and talking about it that I think starting to switch people onto it. So I just think, we talk about diversity of thought, don't we, with mental toughness now, that can help, diversity of thinking. And I think just finding different ways that other people, might talk about mental toughness and use analogies to get that message across is perhaps the way to get around some of that initial reticence.
Yeah. And, we've tried hard, and you've been a big part of this because you're very good at communicating the message. And, you use the pizza image a lot, and we now begin to see a lot of people that we've never been in touch with coming back with a pizza image. But I know that you and I spotted one 2 or 3 days ago, somebody on the west coast of the States.
Yeah.
They used the pizza image, but the headline was like 90% of people who succeed are mentally tough. You've got to become mentally tough. And oh God, how do we deal with that? So you can see that the message getting hijacked. How do we deal with that? Have any thoughts about that?
I think it's just consistency. I was, funny enough, I was talking to my young son, 17-year-old son, the other day about this, and he's just doing psychology at A-level, lower six. And he was talking about how do you change, and I'm sure you both know more about this than I do, but how do you change mindsets when you're in the majority of the mindset when you're in the minority? And he talked about around consistency of message and flexibility. So flexibility to listen to other people's point of view while still retaining our beliefs. And I think that's really important. I see that a lot from the people in the mental toughness family, if you like, so in the AQR family, that have been using the tool for a while. It's that consistency of the message, consistency of the model, and sticking to the 4 C's model and not bastardizing it or changing it too much. And that flexibility to say, okay, well, we understand you and your approach, and that's fine, but actually here's ours, and this is what we believe in. And I think over time that will prevail.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, that especially the flexibility bit kind of resonates, because you always have that sense of kind of meeting people where they're at. So for my experience working in the academic side of things, where you don't exaggerate claims. If anything, you undersell claims because everything's sort of got to be falsifiable and stuff. That's just good science. But then in some of the practitioners' world, and certainly like LinkedIn, for example, people will take such liberties because, of course, they're trying to sell a service. And I think this sort of rigid, well, no, that's wrong, almost sort of puts people in opposition, which isn't really effective. So I think trying to get that kind of message across where you're not devaluing the integrity of the construct, but you're not just telling people that they're plain wrong as well. So we're talking about practitioners there. When you're working with individuals, you say that they will often have sort of preconceived notions of what mental toughness is or isn't. Does that ever follow through even after the setup when you're providing feedback to people? You kind of got the report and stuff like that. Are people often, because it's normatively scored, sometimes people are a bit surprised by their findings and stuff. What do you find? What's your experience with that, and how do you kind of manage those situations?
Yeah, it's a great point. You do get that a lot. You get some people that often say, "Oh, I was really surprised, but I thought I'd be higher." And I always say, "Look, I want you to look at this when we look at the scores, look at the profile. This is not like a school test. You've been conditioned for however long you've been alive to think about yourself scoring out of 10. I've got to get higher. I want you to sort of dissuade yourself of that mindset, and let's have a look at that and what it means." And I think some people are still a little bit a bit nervous about it, think, "Oh, well, I'm only a 6 and it's not very good." Well, actually, you're bang in the middle of average population, and that's okay. And then when they start to see the real importance isn't the overall score, the number, it's the interplay between the 8 factors and how that shows up for them. Then you start to see them start to go, okay, that's a bit more, okay, I get it now. And they move away from this sort of obsession's a strongly word, but focus on the overall score. So I think that really starts to help with people. And again, seeing, I go back to an example I had with one lady who was pretty low overall. She was 1s and 3s, and it was a real challenge was her confidence, and she was looking to make some headway at work in a big organization. So we did some work, we did some coaching over about 6 sessions and about 6-7 months, and got her to a point where she was able to build up the confidence to go and pitch to her MD about this whole job title that didn't exist before, and a role that she could see and everything else. And she was able to do that, and not only got funding for her new role, but got funding for 4 other roles that she would manage, which was amazing. And what was interesting is we didn't need to move her significantly up the spectrum. She just moved a couple of stems in a couple of different areas, and that was enough to make her to do that change, to have that confidence. And so I love the ability to show people the movement in themselves and to realize that you don't have to go from a 2 to an 8 to see a big difference. So I think that's a really important bit.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, people do always. I find because it's normatively scored, right? It means that what might be a 7, a STEN of 7 on one factor, isn't a STEN of 7 on another. So sometimes people, as they're sort of on average, they're agreeing to things. They sort of think, "Oh, well, I thought I'd be high in that," forgetting that, well, actually the people that are 8s, 9s, 10s, that top sort of 16% of people, they're strongly agreeing to those kind of things. And I think it's just that sort of context in which people do it. And like I'm always saying to people, I mean, you filled out the questions. You were the ones. Yeah, maybe that's why I do more work in academia. You get away with it in sport.
Yeah, I think the other thing around is it's understanding that it brings this point that it's very difficult or it's wrong to make a judgment on someone's mental toughness without actually using the measure. But you can't. How do you see that? And I see so many people say, "Oh, well, they must be mentally tough because of X." It doesn't actually stand true. And the amount of times, and I've caught myself doing this, thinking, "Well, I reckon they're going to be quite high," and then you do it, and you go, "Oh, that's not what I was expecting." And I think it's really important to, as practitioners as well, to not fall into the trap of making assessments and judging people unless we're going to use the tool.
That's a great point, because I I would know. I know the questionnaire pretty well, obviously. And when I'm working with sports teams, I'm always surprised, like by the scores, because you just intuitively, it's so easy to. It's like your brain has a bit of a blind spot to that. You see how people act, and we seem to just think, oh, therefore we know what's going on underneath, and it doesn't seem to matter how much training you have. There's still that intuitive, just sort of human response to think, they must be tough. I do it, and I've been doing this a hell of a long time, and I'm still constantly wrong when I do it. Which, it then, like we get asked quite a bit. We had a journalist in touch recently enough. Can you give us some examples of famous mentally tough people, like, from the world of sport, and giving this, that, the other? Like, no, not unless I know them and I've measured it, in which case, due to confidentiality, no. Yes. So either no because that's confidential, or no because we haven't measured it, and I wouldn't have a clue.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and I think we do it because we always, as human beings, don't we? We jump for the shortcut. We go for recognize the pattern overall. And I think we do that, and so very easy to fall into that habit, and we do it constantly on lots of small insignificant things. But it is training ourselves to make sure we don't do it when it comes to, and that's another reason why, I think some of the other profiling tools that people use, they're fine to a point. Some very good ones out there, some less good ones, but I just don't like the labels. You're a green, or you're a letter, or who wants to be labeled with such a narrow thing. I just find that, that surprising and unhelpful.
You mean there's not just 4 kinds of people in the world, or 16 kinds of people? Or...
Who knew? Yeah, funny that, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
That's, I think, one of the most exciting things about the mental toughness concept, and that journey to identify the 8 factors, which many people still don't realize. A lot of that has come from practitioners. Hasn't actually entirely come from the academic side. That's the beauty of it. It's a marriage of two sources. And people will often talk about the devil's in the detail. Actually, the beauty's in the detail here. And we're learning all along. It's not just that you can combine 2 or 3 factors and it produces another valuable piece of information. But as John's beginning to show, if you look at different combinations of factors, they kind of explain each other as well, without necessarily being dependent upon each other. So I just think there's so much in there. I'm completely amazed all the time with how much we're learning and how effective the tool is at understanding so much.
Yeah. And as you know, Doug, I did that book, The Mental Toughness Metaphors, which, if anyone's not seen it, it's a bit like an Aesop's Fables for mental toughness, collection of short metaphors. And initially I started to write it and look for metaphors to help me understand the 4 C's model and the different factors and how that applied in different scenarios. And then as I started to use the metaphors, actually, this might be an interesting book for other people. And I think it's a good way to, I think I found that using metaphors and little stories is a good way to go back to that original question you asked me a few minutes ago about how do you sort of get the message across to people? How do we get around that barrier of mental toughness, mental weakness? And I found stories and metaphors are a good way to be able to do that, but also a good way then to be able to explain it and how actually you can't just make a judgment on somebody's overall score based on some behavior that you might see, because different factors are at play.
I think putting it all into perspective, when we started 20 years ago, there was a lot of hostility to the term mental toughness, and it really was tough for the first 5 or 6 years. And I think some of us actually got quite bruised. I have to say now there's quite a different general approach. People will listen, people are intrigued because other people are talking about it. But despite that, last week we were in a meeting with a very senior person who just would not accept the term mental toughness and refused to allow us to access her organisation until we changed the term. And I said, well, we can't, it's the correct term. You still occasionally get people like that, but they are disappearing.
They are. And
Yeah.
it's great, we've got a lot of, as you'll know, a lot of public speakers that are talking about the concept now, and they're going out and, they're starting to, although they might not be as sticking as rigidly to the construct as we might like, they're doing a good message of breaking down some of the barriers to the concept of this term of mental toughness. So I think, that's helping as well. Starting to see.
Yeah. I know, Tony, Anthony, that you do a lot of work right across the piece with a whole range of organizations, which is great. It's great for your personal development, but it's also great for us. But you do have a particular interest in SMEs, kind of the engine room of the economy, if you like. And we started out in that sector as well. And it's a long time since I've been in there. What would you say were the biggest challenges for people who lead SME organizations in terms of their mental toughness?
I think it's, when you're starting out, if you're leading or you're founding something, you're building it up, you have to be, I think about my own experience, you kind of have to do all things. You're wearing so many different hats. And I think sometimes by that very nature of what got you there, it's understanding that what got you to that point isn't necessarily going to get you to where you need to be. So I think mental toughness is a really good tool to understand how you think and understand and get insights onto how that has helped you, but actually how it might be holding you back. Interestingly, I was working with a independent spirit brand. I have to be careful. I don't give the game away, but an independent spirit brand created by a founder. They had a failed sale, which had really knocked them back quite a bit. They were going to sell to a really global brand. That didn't happen. It was in the middle of COVID as well. And so they were trying to get sales back up again and sort of recollect themselves. And he initially brought me in because to sort of build up the resilience of the team. And so again, did a mental toughness profile of everybody from the founder right down to all the individuals, only about 17, 18 strong in this particular business. But what was interesting was his profile was all over the place in terms of, you had real wild differences in the 8 factors. And it was a real challenge to be able to get him to understand the impact of how he was thinking was actually having an impact or leading to some of the challenges that he was seeing in the business. And that was probably my biggest challenge. Everyone else actually embraced it. There was a bit of reticence about the term mental toughness. So we had to do that positioning piece that I talked about. But then going back to him, the real challenge actually was working with him to understand how his mental toughness profile was showing up and having the impact on the business, that where it was helping and where it was hindering. So I think, as a founder, as someone who's leading an SME, it's understanding that how your profile is shaping the culture of the organization, especially in the smaller, where you don't have sheer weight of numbers, can sort of dissolve some of the cultural impact sometimes of 1 or 2 leaders. It can but in SME, it's much more important.